Okay, who's the singer?
Gordon Lightfoot?
Nope.
Pete Seeger.
Good guess.
Waylon Jennings.
Not Waylon Jennings. Older generation.
Pete Seeger.
Not quite, but how about Arlo Guthrie? As far as the verses, I think there must have been hundreds of made-up verses for Shenandoah by all the people on the trail and on the high seas back in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. We're there today, but we're really in air-conditioned comfort, avoiding the heat and the difficulties of the trail. So far, we've come as far as Bent's Fort on this mountain branch of the trail. And today we get to go through the Raton Pass and down to where the two branches of the trail joined. This Cimarron cutoff, Cimarron route, shorter but drier, is what we can look at next week. So here's where we are today. Brief announcement about another event. Ordinarily, this meets not at the Champaign Library, but at the Urbana Library. For this semester, our meetings are being held at the Savoy Rec Center. Our Urbana Library's downstairs room is being remodeled. But if you're interested in archaeology, this East Central Archaeological Society, East Central Illinois, offers these programs on the third Thursday of each month. The talk coming up the day after tomorrow, how climate change affects or threatens Illinois' cultural heritage. So that one might well be interesting, as are all the others. For some reason this year we have two talks about the archaeology of privies. You can find very interesting things, it seems, in those archaeological spots. But there's those and there are various other talks being given. I can send you email you a copy of this PowerPoint show, which includes this information. And if you're not on the list for receiving email handouts, brochures, and so forth, would like to get on that list, here's the sign-up sheet. Anybody want to be added to it today? Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and turn on the fans. Thank you.
Good books on the trail. The one on the left is quite good. I knew for sure that I'd seen it in the library, and I did, but the copy is in the Urbana Library. You can check it out from there. No local library has a copy of this excellent guidebook for those who want to drive the Santa Fe Trail. But there's other ways to get it. The book itself is, well, first written back in the 1980s, revised every 8 or 10 years since then. Very thorough and detailed account of what's to be seen as you drive the route today. How do you get copies? If you don't know about bookfinder.com, you will now think, where have you been all my life? Because this is by far the best website for purchasing both in print and out of print, unused, rare or used copies of books. It's one-stop shopping. It displays all the holdings of Amazon, ABE, Biblio.com, Alibris, and a whole bunch of other book-selling websites. So you can compare prices and availability of copies. It appears in various versions. The one I like is the classic search display, which sorts out the books by website, basically Amazon here and so forth, giving you basic information on how to get these copies. So if you haven't discovered Bookfinder, I think you will enjoy it. Trails. The National Park Service puts out a brochure and keeps track of all of the great historic trails across the country. Here's the entire system shown as one. The purple one here, of course, is the one we're following in this course. In earlier Tuesdays at 10s, we've done the Oregon Trail out here. The branch from that to California we have not done, but there it is. And of course, the National Road coming in from the east is one we've looked at. But these are the western trails. The one shown in black is the most recent of all these. Of course, that's Route 66. So even that gets included in this whole system. We're looking at contacts between in effect, the Anglos and the Hispanics in North America. And this Santa Fe Trail was the first big link between these two cultural areas. It's worth remembering that the Hispanic population in New Mexico did not cross the border to enter the United States. The border crossed them with the Mexican border, which we will be looking at, next 2 weeks from today. But still, that's an important factor, of course, in bringing together these various interesting groups. Last time we talked a bit about race and racism, because anybody dealing with this part of the world in the 19th century has to deal with the fact that their attitudes were quite often not those shared by many of us. But that's the way people thought about each other. All of these different cultures we're looking at had various attitudes about this. Racism itself, belief in racial superiority, well, let's just say that Hitler gave that idea a bad name. It had been more fashionable before his time. But since then, the alternative is not racial, which is biological, but what we might call cultural arrogance, learned group behavior. The word ethnic that you'll often hear is very useful because it combines those two things without saying which one is the more important. So it's nice to be vague when there's no certainty at all. So some people can assert that their way of life is just better than anybody else's. The emotions are pretty much the same, whether it's belief in race or belief in culture. You're either born that way or you've got to be carefully taught. Those are the lyrics from South Pacific that summarize this whole thing. But these are themes we have to look at. And many of these people linked by the Santa Fe Trail do provide many examples of these views. One important factor with which this trail was involved was the fur trade. Beaver skins, enormously fashionable from the 17th century or even before, down to the mid-19th century. Even in the Middle Ages, rich furs from Arctic lands were highly desirable. Back in those days, they had to come from places like Muscovy, which today we call Russia. But in North America, the beaver and the trade in beaver skins and furs was an enormously productive trade, producing wealth for those taking part in it. It's fascinating to study. There were corporations set up by wealthy businessmen in New York who ultimately got most of the profits. But at the other end of this were the rugged mountain men who did this for a living, who loved the way of life that they enjoyed, and who were definitely not highly paid individuals. They were unique individuals working with the Indian tribes to gather these furs, and working so intensively that the fur-producing lands were worked out. The beaver were pushed near to extinction as the fur trade and as the settlers and as the mountain men moved further west. Back in the 1600s, Illinois was at the heart of the fur trade. By this time, it's the Rocky Mountains, this northern area, and the one that most affects the Santa Fe Trail is this portion of the Colorado Rockies, a principal trapping area in 1840. Bent's Fort, of course, was ideally located to have the mountain men bring in those furs, to bundle them up, pack them up, ship them east. What was done with those furs, the famous tricorn hats in the 18th century, headgear down through the mid-19th century made use of these beaver skins. Not the outer shaggy part, but once that hair was rubbed off, the inner fur, a very fine substance. This whole thing was brought to an end when fashion changed after centuries. Silk hats, other material to make the hats from, came to replace fur. But for these interesting centuries, this is a quite significant phenomenon. If you like excellent historical novels, otherwise known as westerns, if you will, these two are classics. How many of you have read The Big Sky by A.B. Guthrie? Brilliant portrayal of the mountain men. You do have to get used to the rough language that they used, and of course that's very much an authentic part of the time. Frederick Manfred, a member of the Sioux Nation, wrote a number of good historical novels. Lord Grizzly is one that I read back in the 60s and was very impressed by. The memories of, well, the scenes in both these books are ones that will stick to you. Lord Grizzly is the story of Hugh Glass, a mountain man, and his tale has recently been made into a movie, The Revenant. How many of you have seen this one? It's another version of the Hugh Glass story. The actual facts are few and far between. The novelists and movie makers who have taken this story have taken it in different direction. The word revenant means basically someone who has come back from the dead. And of course the famous event is that Hugh Glass, mauled by a grizzly bear, his party of fur trappers knew that hostile tribes and warriors were nearby. They could not stay with him. They had to leave. One or two men were left behind to make sure that he was really dead, but even they moved out. He was not dead. He dragged himself hundreds of miles, it seems, to the nearest fur trading post on the Missouri River. And then comes revenge. The whole story, quite fascinating, wonderfully well told by Manfred's novel, interestingly told in the movie version, which differs in a number of ways from the novel. But I do recommend, well, both of them, and you can compare and see what you think. Hugh Glass himself gets a paragraph, or well, a page, I guess, in the New Encyclopedia of the American West. If you're connected with the U of I library, the entire contents of this 1,000-page book are available online for free for you to look up just by going click, click, click on your computer. If you don't have a U of I card, then, well, it's a bit different. By the way, if you join OLLI, the OLLI program, one of the benefits is an iCard. So you would then have full access to all the holdings of America's 5th largest library. I'll send this email out. You can read the fine print here at your leisure when you get this one. But this gives you what facts are known about Hugh Glass's famous adventure. The only witness to his crawl, of course, is himself. On the A.B. Guthrie novels, he wrote 6 of them portraying the Rocky Mountain frontier from the 1830s down to the 1970s. The first 3 there on the left do form a trilogy centered on a very sympathetic character, Dick Summers, solid, reliable, dependable, dealing with the changing West in the early 19th century. The other 3 novels take descendants of, well, the wagon train families in the way west and follow their descendants on down to the 20th century. But Dick Summers is the memorable character, hired by a wagon train on the Oregon Trail to be their guide. At one point, a young boy died of disease, had to be buried in the middle of nowhere. The mother says, no one will ever know where his body is resting. And then Dick Summers says the right thing, ma'am, I can always find the way back to this site. But that's the situation. By 1846, the Santa Fe Trail was flourishing. The Mexican War was about to break out and did in that year. We'll take a look at that, week after next, when we look at violence on the trail. On that trail itself, you would think the U.S. government and the U.S. military would play a role. They did, as far as the Mexican border, which, as you can see, was up there on the Arkansas River in the first half of the 19th century. Bases, frontier forts, log stockades, and adobe houses, originally back closer to Westport and the Missouri border. Fort Larned, which we can take a look at now, is a post that was built in the second half of the history of the Santa Fe Trail. For the first 2 decades, when you organized your convoy and headed west, you were pretty much on your own. There might be U.S. military patrols that would come out and escort some of the convoys as far as the Mexican border, or you might simply have to plan your own defensive measures against possible Indian attacks or other violence on the trail. Fort Larned was built at the end of the 1850s, and again, was intended to be the base of providing peace and security as much as they could for these wagon train groups. The National Park Service maintains it today, has restored it today, built just as if, or just like Bent's Fort. The original techniques of architecture have been used to bring Fort Larned in Kansas back to life. And if I haven't already done so, I'll send you a copy of this National Park Service brochure. It was indeed the guardian of the Santa Fe Trail. The U.S. government and the War Department, in its infinite wisdom, often sent infantry forces out here to garrison Fort Larned. The Indians were mounted, they moved fast. Foot soldiers chasing cavalry is not the smartest idea in the world. But at least they could keep up with the speed of the wagon trains and protect them. The Indian Bureau was headquartered here for negotiations, dealings with the tribes, working to maintain peace, working to resolve quarrels between the tribes, which was a major factor throughout this whole period. And the U.S. government gave that their best effort. The final fate of the tribes, of course, was a sad and unfortunate one, but the worst of that part came after 1861 on into the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, the final Indian Wars. The tribes were totally independent back during this period, but they could and did work with U.S. government Indian agents. The fort itself looked like that. You think a fort ought to have walls. We'll address that when we look at the video that's coming up. And we can do that right now. This was indeed the great wagon road to the southwest, 781 miles of prairie, storms, floods, wildfires, mosquitoes, and gnats. This was 20 days travel west of the Missouri River, steamboat landings, travel out as far as Fort Larned, 3 weeks, get supplies, get fresh horses, fresh mules and oxen perhaps. And then another 5 weeks to get to Santa Fe. So it was a 2-month journey across the Great Plains. The fort today is very much what it looked like in 1867. That's the year they've chosen to restore it. Park rangers, of course, can provide all the information. You can take a walk both around it and around the nearby countryside. And if you are a rut nut, you can follow the ruts of the Santa Fe Trail. Uneven ground, don't trip at a prairie dog hole, and don't chip off portions of adobe as souvenirs. The main parade ground there in the center. Doesn't every fort have a wall? The answer is no. No wall ever surrounded Fort Larned. In most forts found on the Great Plains, there were good reasons for not having walls. As each was a center of military power, the tribes were very reluctant to attack such a place directly. Raiding occasionally to steal horses was one thing, but attacking the fort, no. And again, if you want to have a stockade, it would take timber, which did not exist out on the Great Plains. There was one other fort built with some adobe walls, but many of these forts, like this one, were, in this sense, undefended. The soldiers who were based there would provide the defense. Horse stealing, though, was something they would have to try to deal with. Water supply, the Pawnee Fork of, I think, the Arkansas River would guarantee a water supply to the base. The big parade ground in the center would be used for drilling the troops. Marching in ranks sounds silly to us, but it had a practical purpose back in the days of single-shot muskets. Formations, lines, drill meant that you could deliver firepower and also control the flow of a battle. Without linear formations, you are one man on a horse, and how can you control, say, well, in many cases, bigger forces than were out here. But even a force of a few dozen or a few hundred men could benefit from these linear formations. Uniforms, mounted troops, dragoons, cavalry, would have looked like that. The history keeps track of the 33 different infantry companies in the old, small U.S. regular army of those days. Wide variety of weapons, swords and sabers for hand-to-hand combat were still a part of life. Single-shot muskets, and those shorter rifles are the carbines, more suitable for using them from horseback. You would definitely have to train your horse not to get spooked when you fire a shot close to its ear. Training cavalry horses to not panic and throw off their riders would be an essential part of cavalry training in these days. Revolvers come in to replace single-shot pistols in the 1850s and 60s. Small cannon, not great big ones, suitable for blasting the walls of fortresses. The 12-pounder mountain howitzer may be the largest size of a piece of artillery that a fort like this would need. Solid cannonball, not too effective. Grape shot, like a giant shotgun shell, more effective. The tribes that were on the Great Plains, each with their own domain, shown here. The people, the garrison, and the Indian agents at Fort Larned would have to deal with all of them. And here's an example of routine operations. Ordering a company of the 1st Cavalry to be sent back to Pawnee Fort to protect a mail party. Cheyenne Indians attacked a working party on the Union Pacific, the railroad that, as we will see in our final class, came in stage by stage, putting an end to the Santa Fe Trail, replacing it with the rail lines. But the railroad parties building that, even in the 1870s and 80s, had to be protected. Artifacts from that period and from that construction work, archaeological items, excavated, found, put on display. There's a rather squashed tin cup, for example, and a canteen looking rather battered. Knives looking somewhat the worse for wear after 150 years of rusting. Negotiations, conferences held with the U.S. Indian agent moderating and trying to arrange peace agreements both with the tribes and the U.S. people and also between the tribes themselves. An essential part of operations for the U.S. government's presence out here. Arapaho chiefs dealing with the Indian agents. Nice picture showing, again, the standard uniform and the carbine being carried. Supplies, commissary goods. The storeroom is available for you to look in and browse around. Quartermaster storehouse. For the infantry barracks, no privacy, of course, for the average privates in those days. The name private and privacy do not go together in the military back then. There's a few names of individuals who are recorded as having lived in this post. That looks like it might be a medical facility, a hospital room, for what crude techniques existed in the mid-19th century. Blacksmiths' essential work, creating horseshoes, creating and repairing iron tools of all sorts, took, of course, great skill, as it always has.
So how many times a day do you have to change the water?
I don't know, once a year.
Like that. And it was like the 4th of July sparkler. It was.
I guess that'd be the water in which you would quench the iron that you're working on before the next stage of perfecting it.
Yeah, we think it's a pro. Every piece is different, so. I had to add the sound effects, I'm sorry. It just looked like that.
That is so cool.
Supply room packed with stuff brought out, of course, in wagons along the Santa Fe Trail. Huge convoys of supplies located here, issued as needed, replenished by the inevitable convoys going back and forth. Necessities received, stored, issued, quartermaster personnel keeping careful paper trail of all these supplies that were issued. Flannel shirts, cotton clothing, rubber blankets for rainy weather. The rubber in the 1840s and 50s was not what it later became. It was subject, for example, in extreme heat, it would melt. So a rubber raincoat might not work too well. Nails, specific sizes, each in its own container. Could those be coffins? Officers' quarters, a bit more, well, comfortable than the enlisted men. A captain or major or lieutenant colonel might have pretty decent quarters, a couple of rooms. He would be allowed to bring his wife out on the frontier. Social life when there were half a dozen women within several hundred miles would be whatever they made of it. A married lieutenant might have a smaller space to live in. Bachelor lieutenants, a single room if they were lucky. But at least it would be more comfortable than the enlisted men in their barracks. A well, availability of water, of course, always essential. New troops arriving might have to be put under canvas for a while. The garrison here would have a standard size, but that might be increased when additional troops were needed at fairly short notice. The entire U.S. military in those days was tiny in comparison to what it is today or what it became during the American Civil War. More on that in a couple of minutes. But that's Fort Larned. Any questions about that?
Question?
Yeah.
Were they building, was that stone? The buildings at the fort?
They were not stone. They were, I think even here, they were adobe. There might have been a few stone buildings, but most of them were not. Okay, there's Bent's Fort. That was as far as we got last week on the trail. What we can now do is follow this branch of the trail down through the Raton Pass to where the two branches of the trail coincided. This is something you'll see if you go to Bent's Fort today. We saw this, 15 or 18 years ago. Driving along the highway toward Bent's Fort, you will see behind a fence these creatures. There is some rancher out there who enjoys African wildlife. He maintains a herd of zebras. He maintains various species of antelope. They definitely look like they did not belong in the Great Plains, and they were certainly not there in 1846. But let's move on to Trinidad, New Mexico, and take a look at this area between Bent's Fort and Trinidad, Colorado, excuse me. We're not quite yet in New Mexico. "13 miles from La Junta on the Santa Fe Trail in today's Comanche National Grassland, the park rangers here have built this overlook from which people can get a good view of the entire region, the natural environment, the historic location of the trail. The mountains are barely visible today. You can see them though there on the horizon. But from here, the prairie travelers would have had their first glimpse of the high ground at the end of their grassy journey. Today, hidden by those clouds, we'll see them a little bit later, the famous Spanish Peaks. And also the prominent single flat-topped Fisher's Peak, the guidepost, the pilot knob, as it were, for Raton Pass. And we move a few miles. 16 miles from La Junta, Colorado, in the Comanche National Grasslands, this Timpas picnic area is a nice spot to stop, and it is on the Santa Fe Trail. Tempest Creek right over there was usually wet. The water was pretty awful, but it was life-sustaining. And it guided the traders and the wagons, and then later a railroad line came this way as well, although the trains, of course, didn't need the water. There's a small town of Tempest that has been here. There's not much left of it today. And it was the home of a stage station and a ranch headquarters until the early 1900s. Irrigation projects out here failed. Progress came to a halt in the 1920s. The land has reverted to, well, what the rest of the world would call steppe. There's wildlife out here, although it's rarely visible. They keep to themselves. And as it says here, most of them live underground, come out in the nighttime. There are plenty of buzzards chowing down on roadkill by Highway 350, and hawks as well. On a lucky day, one could see an antelope, a pronghorn. Those are bullet holes in the image there. Somebody took a shot at it. The country here looks very much as it did at the time of the Santa Fe Trail. And right now we're standing in some barely visible trail ruts. Following that line right there. And this goes past another water source on this desolate stretch, Iron Springs. In 1851, Lieutenant John Pope, later a Union general, came this way. And he wrote, "We marched at the usual hour, 7 a.m., and at a distance of 13 miles, we found a large water hole and boiling spring. The taste of iron in the spring is very strong. Deep trails of antelope and deer lead to the spring from every point of the compass." The ruts don't form a single channel, of course, but form several different ones, pretty much parallel to each other. Today, the actual spring is covered by that concrete box that's visible right there. The mules and the oxen of the trail days don't use it anymore, but local livestock do. Here's the bed of Tempest Creek, rather a cruel name on this long dry stretch of the trail because it was almost always entirely dry. Now there was one reliable spot, and you could see it in that cluster of rocks down there with the bushes covering it. This is the famous hole in the rock. A deep hole filled with water, always available even when the creek was dry. Today, hole in the rock itself is dry, filled with sand. The water table has dropped since 1846, when Susan McLaughlin wrote in her diary, "Camp number 4, hole in the rock. Rather a place of some celebrity our camp is in tonight. I have not yet visited the great well, and therefore cannot describe it according as presented to my own vision. But from what others say, it is a large hole in a rock filled with clear, cold water, and to which a bottom has never as yet been found. Tomorrow, however, I hope to be able to visit, and if I find it different from what I have already said, I will mention it." They camped for a full day, and so she did have a chance to visit the rock. The next day, took a walk this afternoon through the pinon woods adjacent. The tree itself, the pinon, is quite indifferent in appearance. The trunk is scrubby, the leaves short and coarse. This may be attributed, though, in part to the barren soil and the almost continual drought in this part of the country. The hole in the rock I found pretty much the same as described. The scenery around it quite romantic. Rocks covered with cedar trees, shelving and craggy precipices, pearly brooks and green groves through which are seen bounding the stately antelope and timid hare, while the ear is greeted by the soft warble of feathered songsters. It is quite the place in which to build a lover's castle and plant his gardens. She definitely had a romantic sense, and her descriptions were perhaps more vivid than the landscape deserved. For weeks of travel across this long, dry stretch of the Santa Fe Trail, heading southwest toward the Raton Pass, the towering bulk of the Spanish Peaks was a major landmark. Mountains with snow on top of them, tempting sight for those who had to travel across flat, grassy Great Plains without much water. And on directly ahead, the landmark, rather flat-topped peak that you see there, Fisher's Peak, otherwise known as Raton Peak, the key, the guide point for the Raton Pass. Again, major landmarks approaching the mountainous end of this plains portion of the trail. The Spanish Peaks. Here at the end of that long dry stretch was a rather wonderful sight, a permanent river. Susan McLaughlin's wagon train made it here one day after they left Hole in the Rock. Rio Purgatoire, the river of the souls in purgatory. The frontiersmen didn't bother to translate purgatoire into purgatory. They went phonetic and called it the picket wire. But by whatever name, it was a welcome sight. Okay, that's the end of the driest part, I think, of the trail so far. Any questions about all that? Let's move on towards Raton Pass itself. A major obstacle to wagon traffic. Back in 1821, when William Becknell made that first journey, he went through the Raton Pass with a mule train with bags on the mules. A year later, he, in effect, discovered the Cimarron Cutoff, which was done with wagons. So that alternative existed. You could take wagons over the Raton Pass, but let's hear what an ordeal that was. We're heading towards the Raton Pass. For us, it's going to be an easy interstate passage of about 20 minutes. For the people on the Santa Fe Trail, it was radically different. It was a tremendously demanding stretch. It took from 5 to 7 days to cross this pass, making just a few miles a day. This wooden exit would take us to the former ranch of Uncle Dick Wooten in 1865. He had a stage station here and a toll gate because he did his best to improve the passage over the Raton Pass. The current ranch at that location does not contain any of the remains of the old Uncle Dick Wooten stage site. His toll road that he had improved was purchased by the Santa Fe Railroad when it finally came through here in 1878. And the railroad tracks that are used today by Amtrak and others were laid on the line of the toll road that he had built. This is the high point of the pass at the boundary between Colorado and New Mexico. Susan McGoffin, of course, had her comments. For her, this was the hardest part of the journey. There were sudden turns giving a glimpse of the green valley below. The Raton Pass was a total of 20 miles. There were something like 53 stream crossings over the little Raton Creek that came down the pass. The boulders, the rugged hairpin turns, all this was a nightmare for the people who had to make this crossing. The wagons were hauled up with doubled and tripled ox teams, or even by manpower. Something like 2 miles a day, or perhaps a bit more, over the boulders and through the pines. But this was very high altitude. We're well over 6,000 feet. The working men, the laboring men gasped, and that increased the difficulty of, well, the work they had to do. Richens Lacey Wooten, known as Uncle Dick Wooten, was the man who made it a bit easier to get over this pass. He had earned his living in Colorado as a trader, trapper, hunter, farmer, finally building the toll road here and the toll station in 1866. It looked like that. He improved some 27 miles of the toughest part of the road. There were hillsides to cut down, he said, rocks to blast and remove, and bridges to build by the score. I built the road and made it a good one. Initially, the charge was $1.50 for one wagon or buggy, 25 cents for one horseman. He changed those prices from time to time, of course. The Indians were always allowed to use the toll road free of charge. In 1879, the Atchison-Topeka-Santa Fe Railroad bought the right-of-way from Wooten, and the following year the railroad built all the way through Santa Fe along his trail's line. And that put an end to the era of the Santa Fe Trail. Red River Peak, a major landmark for the Santa Fe travelers coming this way. You can see herds of pronghorns. Deer. Enjoying the shade. Cimarron, New Mexico dates back to the 1840s. Settlers, including Kit Carson, first came here in the mid-40s. And as early as the 1850s, Cimarron was an important stop for wagon and stage traffic on the mountain route of the Santa Fe Trail. The most famous resident here, perhaps, well, perhaps not the most famous because Kit Carson was that. but certainly the most prominent resident was frontiersman Lucien Maxwell. This was the headquarters of his 1.7 million acre Maxwell land grant. He acquired that grant through his father-in-law, Charles Beaubien, an associate of the Bents at Bents Fort. And in 1870, he sold the grant to a group of investors. The whole block across from the St. James Hotel here was once the location of Lucien Maxwell's huge mansion, built in 1858, burned down, much battered and aged, in 1885. That mansion had luxurious furnishings hauled over the Santa Fe Trail by Maxwell, including 2 grand pianos, gaming tables, roulette wheels, pool tables. Maxwell's dinner table was open to all, and trail travelers took advantage of his hospitality. Many Santa Fe traders knew Lucien Maxwell and did business with him. This was once called the first civilized stop on the trail in New Mexico. I guess it depends on how you define civilized. This has been here since the trail days. The old Aztec mill, operated as a grist mill by Lucien Maxwell between 1864 and 1870, late in the period of the trail. The trail travelers brought flour here for the last push to Santa Fe, and the Ute Indians and Jicarilla Apaches were issued government flour rations bought from Maxwell. Today the building is owned by the CS Cattle Company. Just east of the St. James Hotel, the Carey Hardware and Livery Stable, today a private residence. Built in 1872, a hardware store and livery stable. It also housed the Cimarron News and Press. During one confrontation, it is said, irate citizens threw the newspaper press into the Cimarron River. It doesn't say what the argument or confrontation was about. Formerly called the Don Diego Hotel, the St. James Hotel, 2-story structure built in the 1870s by a French immigrant, Henri Lambert. Lambert had once been a chef for General Grant and President Lincoln. For a while, this hotel was a hangout for outlaws, including the notorious Clay Allison. And in the room that served as a saloon, 26 bullet holes still show in the pressed tin ceiling. Recognize a lot of those names of former patrons of this location. Davy Crockett II, not famous, but his father was. Just a few miles south of Cimarron, you can see some very clear Santa Fe Trail ruts. Now, the trail came this way. That's that. We've got just a few more minutes. Here's quotations from Susan McGoffin's diary. I'll email the PowerPoint show to you folks. You can read this at your leisure. Most magnificent scenery, of course, camp number 8. Unfortunate, a wagon was turned over, the bed and bows broken, delay of some hours. Almost every 50 or 100 yards, there are large stones or steep little hillocks. Just the things to bounce a wagon wheels up, unless there is the most careful driving. She herself, pampered as much as her husband was able to do, but still she would get out and walk, covered with dust, whenever she felt like it. Traveling on at the rate of half a mile an hour, with the road growing worse and worse. Horseback exercise is my delight, and of the riding today I shall not complain, though the sun was very warm. Worse and worse the road. You're even taking the mules from the carriages this afternoon, and a half dozen men, by bodily exertions, are pulling them down the hills. It takes a dozen men to steady a heavily laden wagon with all its wheels locked. 600 or 800 yards during the one day. A more agreeable day, Friday the 28th, the carriage tongue broke entirely out. Carrying that extra timber all the way from Council Grove, Kansas, was essential for making repairs at very short notice, which is what they had to do at times like that. And one last item here of some interest, and this is a theme we'll get to next week. At the little village of San Gabriel, a little Mexican boy, 9 or 10 years, asking mi alma, her husband, to buy him. 3 years since, the Apache Indians, beside depredations to other families, murdered his father. His mother was then dead, carried him off prisoner. After 3 years of hard servitude among them, the little fellow ran off, found his way to the house of an old Mexican who resides here in a lone hut, the picture of misery. Here this boy has been for 2 months under the fostering care of the old compadre, but growing weary of this life, which was not better than that with the Indians, he now wishes to be bought with the sum of $7 which he owes the old man for his protection. But tomorrow the money is to be paid, and henceforth Francisco is our servant. We'll skip this part, and next week take a look at that shorter but drier, in many ways more hazardous alternative to the Raton Pass route, the Cimarron Cutoff. So that's all for now.